Have you ever been in a room with someone you love and yet felt completely alone? Not because they walked away, but because something in them already has. Why does that happen? And more importantly, how do you recognize the quiet signs before love fully slips into silence? Welcome to Stillness Unfolded. In today's video, we're going to take a deep, mindful look at a truth many of us sense but often struggle to name: the slow, silent fading of love. Together, we'll explore the 3 subtle yet profound signs that someone may no longer be emotionally with you. But more than that, we'll uncover how Zen teachings and Buddhist wisdom can help you observe without judgment, let go without bitterness, and begin healing in the most compassionate way possible by returning to yourself. This video contains rich insight, emotional clarity, and spiritual truth, so make sure you watch until the very end to receive the full transformation this teaching offers. If you find value in this journey, please consider giving this video a like, subscribing to Stillness Unfolded, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps us grow and bring more light to others walking this same path. Let's begin. Sign 1. Presence fades silently. Not all departures begin with footsteps. Some begin with a gaze that no longer lingers. A smile that once reached the eyes, now barely curves the lips. You sit across from them. The same table, the same room. But something has shifted. They are there, yet somehow they are not. It's one of the most disorienting experiences, to be in the presence of someone you love and still feel alone. Not because they've left, but because something in them has. What was once an effortless exchange of energy now feels like reaching into the dark. You speak, and their responses arrive like echoes, late, light, lacking depth. There is no confrontation, no argument. Just a growing stillness between 2 hearts that once danced in sync. Buddhist thought reminds us that the absence of attention is the beginning of emotional detachment. And it begins not with cruelty or criticism, but with disinterest. You may notice how they stop asking questions they once asked daily. How their gaze drifts to their phone more than your face. How their silence no longer feels comfortable, but heavy, like unsaid things lingering in the air. It's not the absence of words that hurts. It's the absence of meaning behind them. In mindfulness, we train the heart to see beyond appearances. And here, in these moments of emotional drift, we're called to witness what is no longer being said. Because presence, true presence, is not about proximity. It's about being felt. When someone no longer inhabits the moment with you, when their soul starts stepping back while their body remains seated, it is one of the earliest signs. But most people ignore it, hoping it's just a phase, a bad day, or stress. And yet, it persists. Long pauses in conversation. Replies that feel more like formalities than engagement. Moments of eye contact that once sparked warmth now pass, without connection. Zen doesn't suggest we panic in these moments. It urges observation. Like a monk watching a candle dim, we are not to flail in the dark, but to gently acknowledge the changing light. There is a kind of sacred pain in this realization, but it's also an awakening. You begin to recognize how much you relied on their presence for your own grounding. You start to notice how your identity, your self-worth, your joy, were tied, perhaps unknowingly, to their nearness. And now, in their emotional absence, a space opens up. A space that feels like loss, but is actually a mirror. A mirror that asks, were you ever fully here with yourself? Or did their presence become your anchor? One of the core teachings of Buddhism is non-attachment, not as cold indifference, but as a pathway to inner stability. When we attach too tightly to another's presence, we begin to define ourselves by it. Their distance then feels like disintegration. Their withdrawal becomes our undoing. But must it be? What if their silence was not a punishment, but an invitation? Not a rejection, but a redirection? Perhaps this is the moment to return inward, to reclaim your own presence, to be with yourself as deeply as you once wished them to be with you. Presence, after all, begins with self-awareness. And when someone else's attention fades, it is the universe's gentle reminder to redirect your own inward gaze. You are not broken because someone grows distant. You are not unworthy because their attention drifts. You are simply standing at the edge of change. The wise do not cling to a fading presence. They bow to it. They let it go with grace, and in doing so, make room for something deeper, and intimacy with their own soul. Sign 2. Communication dulls. There was a time when words flowed like a spring between you. Effortless, clear, alive. Each message carried warmth. Each call was an embrace. Even silence felt full, because it was shared, chosen, meaningful. But now, something has shifted. The pauses between texts grow longer. The replies arrive with less weight, less joy, less urgency. Conversations that once stretched into the night now taper into fragments. Short, clipped, functional. This is how communication begins to contract. Not all at once, but gradually, like a tide receding from the shore. It's not silence that hurts. It's when speech becomes hollow. When the tone is polite, but no longer personal. When the dialogue turns into transaction. A message read, but not replied to. A phone call missed, then not returned. Plans once made with enthusiasm now postponed, or worse, forgotten. In Buddhist teaching, speech is one of the Noble Eightfold Path's core elements. Right speech, in particular. Speech, when rooted in mindfulness and compassion, becomes a bridge. But when connection fades, speech often becomes either a wall or a mask. What was once curiosity becomes convenience. Where there was once inquiry, now there is formality. You ask, "How was your day?" and receive a one-word reply. You share something dear, and they respond with a thumbs up. They speak not to engage, but to maintain the illusion of connection. And you feel it, the weightlessness in their tone, the way their voice doesn't reach your heart anymore. But here's the deeper truth. People don't stop talking because they don't know what to say. They stop talking because they've stopped feeling what they used to feel. And when love begins to dim, speech becomes a chore. Zen encourages us to listen, not just to what is said, but to what is left unspoken. The gaps between the words. The energy behind them. Is it rushed? Is it restrained? Is it robotic? These are not judgments. They are observations. They are insights into where a person's spirit currently resides. When communication becomes mechanical, it's not because someone has forgotten how to care. It's because their care has changed direction. That doesn't make them cruel. It makes them human. The heart, like all things, moves. And when its direction shifts, the mouth follows. In these moments, the spiritual path is not to beg for more words, not to demand longer conversations or chase validation in delayed responses. It is to witness the shrinking space between the spoken and the felt. True connection doesn't need endless words, but it does need truth. And when truth disappears from conversation, no amount of talking can fix what's been lost. You may feel tempted to talk more, to compensate, to double your texts, soften your tone, fill in their silences with stories and effort. But this only makes the void more evident. Because communication, when one-sided, becomes an echo chamber for our own fear of being left behind. Buddhism teaches that when suffering arises, we must trace it to its root. Not the symptom, but the source. And here, the source is not their silence. It is your longing for their words to mean what they used to. It is your ache to feel heard again in the way that made you feel loved. But if their words have lost soul, chasing them will not restore their warmth. Words spoken out of duty can never carry the energy of love. So instead of pleading for conversation, become the conversation you long for. Speak to yourself with the depth they no longer offer. Write what you wish to hear. Say out loud the kindness you deserve. Because communication is not only external. It is the inner dialogue that shapes how we meet the world. And when another's speech begins to fade, let it remind you of the voice within. The one that still whispers, "I am here. I see you. I care." Sign 3. When kindness becomes a performance. There was a time when their kindness came wrapped in spontaneity. The little notes, the shared jokes, the way they reached for your hand not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It felt alive, real, a gesture not just of habit, but of heart. But now, something's different. They still say the right things. They still show up. They still smile. But somehow it feels rehearsed, as if the music is still playing, but the soul has left the melody. This is the third sign, when love transforms from presence to performance. They're still kind, but the kindness no longer nourishes. They still do things for you, but the warmth behind those acts has grown cold. And this is where confusion takes root. Because they haven't left. They haven't shouted. They haven't even said anything hurtful. but you can sense the absence in the presence, the hollowness in the hug, the delay in the kiss, the absence of sparkle behind the words, "I love you." You question yourself. Am I imagining things? Shouldn't I be grateful they're still trying? But inside, you know, effort without emotion is not connection, it's maintenance. Buddhist compassion is not a duty. It is a flowering. It arises naturally when the heart is awake. When awareness and care move together, action becomes sacred. But when love begins to fade, actions often remain out of guilt, obligation, or routine. A dinner cooked. A birthday remembered, barely. A favor fulfilled, but done with a sigh. These gestures aren't cruel, but they are no longer intimate. The problem is not the act. It's the energy behind it. And in Zen, energy, intention, is everything. A cup of tea prepared with love can feel like a healing balm. The same tea, brewed with indifference, is just liquid in a cup. And so when kindness becomes mechanical, it doesn't comfort, it unsettles. You begin to feel like a role is being played, like you're in a relationship that's still running, but the heart of it has quietly exited stage left. This is the paradox of fading love. The exterior often remains intact while the interior has collapsed, like a house with perfect paint, but hollowed beams. And in this moment, many people fall into a trap. They double down on gratitude. They force themselves to accept crumbs in the name of patience. They justify the lifelessness because at least they're still here. But Zen does not ask us to settle for form without spirit. It invites us to awaken to what is real, to feel what is present and what is not. When gestures no longer come from joy, but from habit, the soul begins to ache. Not from neglect, but from dissonance. We crave harmony. We long for authenticity. When someone's words say, "I care," but their energy says, "I'm tired," the dissonance echoes through us like an off note in a silent temple. And here's the subtle teaching. Kindness without heart is not evil, it's simply empty. And emptiness, when not acknowledged, becomes suffering. So what do we do when love becomes a ritual? We don't demand more rituals. We don't chase emotion from the shells of gestures. We breathe. We acknowledge the reality that something once vibrant has now turned still. And we allow that truth to break the illusion we've been clinging to. In Buddhism, every ending is an invitation to see clearly. And here, the fading kindness is not a betrayal. It is a signal that the bond is transforming, that the soul behind the gesture is elsewhere. To stay in denial is to cling. To observe it with awareness is to let go with compassion. Even when someone keeps showing up, their soul may have chosen another path. And that is not your fault. That is not your failure. It is life unfolding in its rhythm, not yours. To accept this is not to stop loving. It is to love with open eyes. To recognize that love, when real, is not a performance. It is presence. It is the invisible thread that infuses every gesture with meaning. And when that thread is gone, no number of kind words, gifts, or favors can replace it. So let the performance pass. Bow to it without anger. Honor it for what it once was, and release it for what it no longer is. Because the most powerful act of kindness you can offer yourself is to stop pretending something still lives when it's already resting. The illusion of fixing what's already gone. This is the point where desperation often sneaks in, quiet, subtle, and disguised as love. You notice they're more distant. You feel the silence stretching. You sense the warmth dimming. And so, you try harder. You message first. You call more often. You plan surprises. You offer parts of yourself you didn't even know you had to give. But nothing changes. Or worse, your effort seems to push them further away. Why does this happen? Because what you're reaching for no longer exists in the way you remember it. You're trying to restore a connection with someone who may have emotionally already moved on. In Buddhism, we often speak of attachment as the root of suffering. But here, attachment doesn't just mean wanting. It means resisting reality. Wanting something to stay the same when it has already begun to transform. And perhaps the most difficult illusion to release is this: the belief that if we just do enough, we can make someone love us again. Let that land for a moment. There is an emotional urgency that arises when we feel someone slipping away. Not because we are broken, but because our sense of stability, our narrative of love, our hope, our imagined future is beginning to dissolve. And in that dissolution, fear is born. Not always fear of loneliness, but fear of meaninglessness. Fear that it was never real. Fear that we weren't enough. So we double down. We polish ourselves. We give more. We become softer, sweeter, smaller. But here's the Zen teaching. What is real does not need to be clung to. What is gone cannot be chased. Trying to revive love that has already died is like trying to reignite a candle by blowing harder on the smoke. You cannot argue someone back into affection. You cannot beg someone into presence. And no amount of kindness can reignite what another has silently chosen to release. What you're battling is not just their distance, but your own attachment to the story you had written with them. The version of the future that is no longer unfolding. The identity that was wrapped in us instead of me. And here lies the sacred paradox. The more you try to hold on, the more love escapes you. Why? Because love, in its truest form, cannot survive in desperation. It needs air, space, truth. And when we smother it with fear, we starve it of the freedom it requires to remain alive. In Zen, we are taught to let go, not as an act of giving up, but as an act of surrendering to what is. When the tree lets go of its leaves, it's not dying. It's preparing for the next season. So must we. When someone begins to pull away, it is not always a rejection. Sometimes, it is a redirection. Not every emotional absence is an accusation. Not every distance is an invitation to run after. Sometimes, silence is a sign from the universe. Return home. Back to yourself. You've wandered far enough. And the painful truth? Sometimes, the person you're chasing no longer exists. Not in the way you remember them. People grow. People shift. Sometimes gently. Sometimes drastically. But often without telling us. They may still wear the same face. Still say the same name. But the energy that once lit the space between you has become a shadow. And if you chase the shadow, you will lose yourself in the process. So pause. Breathe. Feel the ache, but don't obey it. Your longing is valid, but it is not always wise. Buddhism calls this discernment. The ability to see the difference between clinging and compassion, between longing and love, between truth and illusion. You are not here to rescue what has already released you. You are here to wake up. And waking up often begins with heartbreak. Because the breaking of the heart is also the opening of the soul. The illusion was that you needed their return to feel whole. The truth is, your wholeness was never lost. It was only hidden beneath the illusion that someone else had the power to complete you. Zen doesn't ask you to stop loving. It asks you to stop chasing. Because when love is true, it meets you where you are. It does not need to be hunted. It does not need to be earned. So let go. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of reverence. Because something sacred is ended. And something sacred is beginning. And it begins with your choice. To stop reaching outward. And finally return within. Letting go with awareness and compassion. Letting go is one of the most misunderstood acts in human experience. To many, it feels like failure, like surrender, like defeat. But in the eyes of Buddhist wisdom, letting go is not the end of love. It is the evolution of love. To let go does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop carrying what is no longer aligned with truth. Because what is the point of holding on to a moment that no longer exists? What does it serve to cling to an echo, hoping it will become a voice again? The Buddha taught, you only lose what you cling to, not as a warning, but as a liberation. Suffering, in its essence, arises not from change itself, but from our resistance to it. And so, when someone's love fades, when their presence turns to shadow, when their kindness becomes habit instead of heart, you are not being punished. You are being invited. Invited to see. Invited to release. Invited to return. Return to awareness. Return to yourself. Return to the moment. This one, right here, without wishing it were different. But how do you do this when your chest feels tight, when your thoughts race, when memories scream at you in the quiet? You start by witnessing. No judgment. No labeling. Just awareness. You sit with the pain, not to wallow in it, but to understand it. You look it in the eye and ask, what is it you're trying to show me? Pain, when met with resistance, becomes suffering. But pain, when met with presence, becomes a teacher. Zen does not ask us to escape discomfort. It teaches us to enter it fully, with breath, with softness, with honesty. To say, yes, this hurts. Yes, I miss them. Yes, I wish it were different. And then to follow that truth with another. And yet, I will not betray myself by clinging to someone who has already released me. This is not bitterness. This is not hardness. This is compassion. Because true compassion does not just extend outward, it extends inward. To let go is not to cut someone off with coldness. It is to bless them silently in your heart. And walk away because you know you deserve presence, not absence. You deserve realness, not performance. You deserve the kind of love that does not need to be chased to be felt. But this kind of knowing does not come from logic. It comes from stillness. From the quiet courage of sitting alone and feeling it all. The sorrow, the fear, the longing, the grief. And yet, also, the strength. The strength that comes not from pretending you're okay, but from realizing that even in heartbreak, you are whole. Letting go is not about closing your heart. It is about keeping it open while honoring its boundaries. It's about choosing peace over pleading, silence over struggle, and truth over illusion. Many fear that letting go means giving up hope, but that is not the case. Letting go means letting life move, letting karma unfold, letting what no longer serves you dissolve, so that what's meant for you has space to arrive. To let go is to trust the Dharma, the natural law of change. It's to release control and instead rest in the flow of impermanence. Because the truth is, you are not abandoned. What you are experiencing is the unraveling of a karmic knot. And like all knots, it must loosen before it can disappear. So, offer gratitude for the lesson. Bow to the memory without clinging to it. And allow yourself the grace to walk forward, lightly, lovingly, awake. This is not the death of love. It is its transformation. Because when you let go with awareness, you don't lose anything essential. You simply return to the quiet, radiant presence of your own being. Returning to the self, rediscovering inner ground. Once the silence settles, once the chasing ends, and once you've stopped measuring your worth by someone else's presence, what remains? You. You remain. And in that quiet space where their voice once echoed and their energy once lingered, a deeper voice begins to emerge, your own. It doesn't arrive with grandeur. It doesn't demand attention. It whispers. It says, I am still here. I never left. In Buddhism, the concept of anatta, non-self, challenges the illusion that we are fixed identities defined by roles, relationships, and stories. It teaches that the self is not a static label, but a flow of experiences, sensations, thoughts. But that flow is grounded in something stable, awareness. And it's this awareness that becomes your anchor when everything else slips away. So much of who we believe we are is shaped in the mirror of someone else's eyes. We think, I am lovable because they loved me, or I matter because they stayed. But when they turn away, what happens? The illusion begins to fracture. And that's when something sacred happens, if we allow it. We begin to return to our own ground. Not the performance of who we thought we needed to be loved. Not the fragments of ourselves we polished to win their approval. But the raw, untouched self. The one who breathes, exists, feels, and observes, no matter who comes or goes. This return is not a rush. It's not a triumph. It's a quiet reunion. Like a wanderer finally coming home to a place they forgot existed. You remember the books you used to love. The stillness that used to comfort you. The sound of your own laughter when it wasn't dependent on another's smile. You begin to see that wholeness was never something they gave you. It was always yours. Their presence may have reflected it, but it did not create it. This is a radical shift in perception. And with it comes empowerment. Not the kind that shouts or demands, but the kind that bows gently and says, I am enough, even now. Returning to yourself doesn't mean closing the door to connection. It means no longer abandoning yourself when that connection fades. It means you stop waiting for someone else to mirror your worth. You become the mirror. You sit. You breathe. You ask, who am I without their attention? And the answer does not come in words, but in stillness. You are not their rejection. You are not their disinterest. You are not their decision to withdraw. You are the one witnessing all of it. Calm, aware, eternal. Zen says, you are the sky. Everything else is just the weather. Let that settle in your chest. Their love was a season. It came. It bloomed. It taught. And now it moves. But you are the sky that held it all. Unchanged by passing clouds. Unafraid of the rain. Unshaken by the thunder. To rediscover your inner ground is to stand on truth. To breathe into the quiet and find not loneliness, but clarity. There is nothing missing in you. There is only space now. Space not for sorrow, but for growth. Not for regret, but for realization. This is your sacred soil. This is where your next chapter begins. Not in search of someone else to fill the void, but in the fullness of your own becoming. Healing through solitude and stillness. Solitude, to the unaware mind, often feels like punishment. It is the place people try to escape when love withdraws. They run into distractions, into rebounds, into noise. Anything to avoid being alone with what remains. But Zen teaches us the opposite. Solitude is not the absence of love. It is the sacred space where the true love begins. Self-love, soul love, dharma-aligned love. When the world outside grows quiet, the world within begins to speak. In the beginning, it's not easy. Solitude brings you face to face with your rawest thoughts. It magnifies your fears, your longing, your regrets. It peels back every mask you wore for the one who left. But it also gives you something rare. A mirror not clouded by anyone else's reflection. You begin to see the parts of yourself you neglected to nurture. You remember the hobbies you abandoned. You feel the dreams you had shelved to make room for their presence. And slowly, gently, something inside you begins to bloom. Not because someone has returned. Not because someone new has arrived. But because you've stopped leaving yourself behind. Solitude becomes a sanctuary, not a sentence. It becomes the quiet room where healing unfolds, not in dramatic bursts, but in steady breath and gentle moments. In Buddhism, the lotus is a sacred symbol. It grows from the mud, from darkness, from still waters. And yet, it opens, petal by petal, into light. So too, does your heart. You sit with the ache. You let it teach you. You allow yourself to feel without judgment, to grieve without guilt, to exhale without the need to fix anything. Because healing is not about rushing forward. It's about surrendering to where you are. You stop looking for signs from them. You start listening for signs within. You realize that the space they left was never meant to be filled by someone else. It was meant to be felt by you, fully, completely, so that you could remember what you're made of. Stillness reveals what noise hides. And in that stillness, you begin to notice the miracle of your own resilience. How you're still here, still breathing, still capable of laughter, even after loss. How your presence, without them, is still beautiful. That is no small thing. That is grace. Too often we confuse healing with forgetting. We think we must erase their memory, cut ties completely, move on as if they never mattered. But healing isn't forgetting. Healing is remembering without collapsing. It is the ability to see the past clearly, with tenderness, and say, "Thank you for what was. And now, I release you." It is the moment you stop waiting for closure from them and begin creating closure within yourself. Zen says, sitting quietly, doing nothing, spring comes, and the grass grows by itself. That is the essence of this healing. You don't have to force it. You just have to stay present. The transformation will unfold on its own. You may cry. You may laugh at memories. You may wake up with heaviness. And on some days, you may forget they were ever part of your story. This is all part of the rhythm. This is the music of letting go. So stay. In the silence. In the solitude. In the stillness. Because that is where your roots deepen. That is where your spirit regenerates. That is where your peace returns. Not as a gift from someone else, but as the birthright you had forgotten. If you've recognized these signs in your own life, know this. You are not broken. You are awakening. Love, like all things in this world, changes form. And when someone drifts away, it is not always a betrayal. Sometimes it is a redirection, a doorway, a return to your own breath, to your own silence, to your own worth, which was never dependent on their presence, but always rooted in your awareness. The Buddha taught that what we cling to, we suffer from. But what we allow to change, we learn from. And what we learn from transforms us. So the question is no longer, how do I hold on? But rather, what is this moment trying to teach me? If this message has spoken to your heart, I invite you once more. Leave a comment below with your reflections. Click like if it resonated. And subscribe to Stillness Unfolded so you don't miss future insights on Buddhist teachings, emotional healing, and inner peace. And always remember, when someone's love fades, your journey back to yourself begins. Thank you for watching. Until next time, Stay mindful, stay rooted, and keep unfolding.